My name's Jo Case-Spawn and I'm Director of Development here at the Institute, and I lead our work on English devolution. And I'd like to start by thanking Grant Thornton for their partnership with us on this event. This is the third in 3 events that we've been holding together exploring local leadership, and this one, as you know, focuses on mayors, local MPs and ministers and how they can work together. So please do tweet and join in the conversation, and the hashtag is IFGMayors for those of you who are tweeting. So just a few kind of introductory remarks from me before I introduce the panel. Well, everyone's attention may be on the small matter of the general election on June the 8th, but we at the Institute have not forgotten that there are another set of elections happening next week on the 4th of May. So delighted to see you all here to talk about that today. So as well as the local elections, we are of course going to be electing in 6 areas of England new metro mayors. So in Greater Manchester, the Liverpool City region, Tees Valley, the West Midlands, Cambridgeshire and Peterborough and the West of England. And these new directly elected mayors are going to have a range of powers. So they're going to include powers over transport, so things like smart ticketing, the further education system, business support, support to get people off benefits and into work, and in the case of Greater Manchester, some powers over health and social care as well, in terms of taking charge of health and social care spending and decisions. And we've argued here at the Institute that these new metro mayors are the best chance that we've seen to date of devolving real power within England to ensure that devolution is sustainable over time, although I'm sure that's something that we'll want to discuss with you when we get to Q&A. And the fact that these mayors are going to be new, powerful political figures has been reflected in the kinds of candidates that we've seen standing around the country. And for some people, running for mayor has become a more attractive proposition than being a backbench MP. So the kind of questions that we would like our panel to explore today are: what difference are directly elected mayors going to make to local growth, local public services and investment? How should we judge the success of these new mayors? Do they have the right powers, or are there other areas that we should be devolving more powers to? And critically, how are they going to work with local MPs in their areas and with ministers in Westminster to get the best for their places? So moving on then to introduce the panel. First up, Clive Betts is going to speak, and Clive has been an MP since 1992, currently for Sheffield East. In 2010, he was also elected as the Select Committee Chair of the Communities and Local Government Committee. And in the past, he's been Chair of the Department for Environment, Transport and the Regions Select Committee, served as a government whip for 4 years and led Sheffield City Council for 5 years, so has that perspective of both national politics as well as local politics. Jackie McKinley, to my left, is the Chief Executive of the Centre for Public Scrutiny, which provides policy and practical support to help local government to improve its governance. And previously, Jackie was Director of Strategy and Customer Services at Staffordshire County Council. Jim, nice to welcome you, and thanks very much for coming along. Jim McMahon is the MP for Oldham West and Royton, and Shadow Minister for Local Government and Devolution. And Jim was a councillor for 12 years, 4 of which he served as the leader of Oldham Metropolitan Borough Council, and has also served as Labour leader of the LGA and is a fellow of the RSA. And last but very much not least is Andrew Carter, the new Chief Executive of the Centre for Cities and also Deputy Director of the What Works Centre for Local Growth. And Andrew has over 20 years of experience working on urban economic policy issues for public and private development agencies, consultants and research institutes. So what we're going to do is I'm going to hand over in a minute and ask each of our speakers to speak for around 5 minutes on their key reflections on these themes, and then there'll be an opportunity to kind of open up to wider discussion from the floor. So I'm going to ask Clive to kick us off, please.
Okay, thanks very much. Just a few reflections. And it's interesting, as a politician, you always want to change the question at the beginning when you get asked about how mayors are going to work with MPs and ministers. Just as an interesting question is how they're going to work with councillors and council leaders, I think, in the areas and with their public. Now, I have to say, I'm not an enthusiast about elected mayors. I worked on the presumption that our system of government in this country didn't work on the idea of directly elected executives. I'm probably beginning to come round to the idea a bit, because I think I have to accept that we are so much in the era of the personality currently, and that's how public see politics. Do we like that person or this person? that actually having an elected person at local level who people can recognise and see and decide about them is probably something that will help local government and give local government a greater focus. In terms of the mayor, they're going to have a number of different roles, despite the different responsibilities in each of the areas where mayor's been elected. They're going to have a job to run services, and I'll just come and say a bit more of that in a second. They're going to have a job also of wider representation of the figurehead of that local area. And I think this is something we shouldn't underestimate. The mayor simply going on television and saying, this is what I want for my area, this is what this area needs, this is a major problem that's happened, a disaster, this is how I'm going to deal with it. I think that role, that representative role, is actually going to be very important indeed, probably going beyond the powers they actually have. And as a personality, turning the role into something bigger. And I think that's something probably we've seen with the Mayor of London over the years, and something we're going to see in the new mayors as well. Yes, and the role of working with ministers. A lot of this is going to be down to personality rather than simply the formalities of what the job actually gives legally. And I suppose in the end there is some hope for it, in that even if the mayors and the government are of different political persuasion, the idea of mayors is the government's idea at present, so they are going to make them want to make it work. So, but it's going to be down to personality to a large extent. Also, the relationship between the mayors, we shouldn't forget that. If you've got mayors in Liverpool and Manchester, and eventually, hopefully, in Sheffield next year and Leeds at some point, those four mayors in particular could have a significant remit to argue a case for the north of England and the major cities in the north of England. And as a collective voice coming together, I think could be extremely powerful. I think they also have a possibility of changing the nature of local elections. I know many people think they're uncomfortable with the idea of personality rather than policy dominating elections. But the reality of local elections at present, it's national issues that dominate local elections. Maybe with a figurehead people can recognise and relate to, there's a chance that more people will vote on the basis of who their mayor is, rather than which party is doing what at national level. Now, that I think is something we should hope for as a positive outcome from this. Just one or two concerns that I think we ought to be aware of. I'm not sure the public yet grasps devolution. I'm not sure it's been sold terribly well in the areas where mayors are going to be standing, what the whole idea is. I think there are still lots of complications around the multiplicity of different levels of government, particularly in two-tier areas. Do we really want a parish, a district, a county, a combined authority and an elected mayor? So I think the pressure for some form of reorganisation is going to be fairly great. There's also going to be a difficulty of the public understanding who is responsible for what. I mean, already I think most of us MPs know that a lot of them think that we're responsible for the council. But you run the council, don't you? Really, when they've got a problem, then in the end you sort it out. Well, no, it doesn't work like that. But just in the Mayor of Manchester, that's working out there, and some of the other areas, the Mayor will run transport. In some places they'll run the police and fire, in others they won't. There are for other services like skills and infrastructure, they will chair the combined authority. So they won't be individually accountable. They'll have to get council leaders to work with them, and that's going to be an interesting dynamic. And coming back to health and social care, the mayor won't actually be involved in that at all in Manchester. But the public are going to think health and social care, this is the big issue of devolution. We've got a mayor, the mayor must run health and social care, but they won't. So I think there's going to be quite a lot of complications and explanation and understanding for the public to do as well about who is responsible for what. So I think it's a work in progress, all this, and I think there's going to be a lot to do with personalities and how they get on, but also a lot to see how this evolves further in the next few years.
Great, thank you very much, Clive. That was really interesting. And Jackie.
Excellent, thanks, Jo. I'm hopefully going to build on a few of those themes. Over the last 2 years, we've worked in quite a lot of the devolved areas as they grapple with what governance looks like. And I think it's important to recognise the history to this, that most areas only agreed to have a mayor as a very pragmatic decision in order to get a deal. None of them, I think, were kind of, leaping up for it. And also, for a lot of other areas, the prize wasn't big enough or the process was so closed. So I think it's an interesting, I want this to work, but I think there's a model here that is to be tested. There's 3 observations, and some of them will pick up on Clive points. The first is whether the stage is actually big enough for all of these actors. So, at the same, they have similar but very different parts to play, and I think the public is yet to be informed of what they are. And I think from May, another person is going to join the ranks, this time with a clear focus on economy and different elements to that, and this time with a very clear regional focus. Now, the theory is the scope of the devolution deals will help define who is accountable for what. But I think there's real possibility for public confusion, mission creep. I don't think many of their campaigning just limits themselves to, the candidates have been very kind of loose with what they claim they're going to do, which can lead to clashes behind the scenes. And I think this will be particularly the case when it comes to some of the, to make decisions in relation to regional growth does not involve every single constituent member of a combined authority getting the same deal. And I think there's some potential there and some difficult decisions that will need to be made. And I think what struck us, even now, so close to the election, is the naivety of some political leaders and officers in the combined authority areas that their governance framework will manage the mayoral powers. And I think when you say manage, that means limit and control. Now, none of the characters going forward to be mayor are shy and retiring type, so I can't see them agreeing to what the governance framework looks like. But I think there is a great deal to do. Talking about Whitehall, I think the relationship between MPs locally and that, the potential for, very local approach to things being a clash is there. And interestingly, Cornwall, which doesn't have a mayor and a combined authority, has MPs on the board monitoring their devolution deal, which I think is interesting because they haven't had the same constraints around governance and have put in place something that engages stakeholders in a different way. I think the challenge for Whitehall will be how does it engage with mayors, particularly if they are going to live to the ambition of being a single point of accountability, and how that will connect with local leaders, which has been a route through, and local MPs as well. So there's a whole new worldview there, I think, that needs to be brought out. The second point is around governance, which I am obliged to speak about on these occasions. The requirement to have a scrutiny panel as part of this mix is positive, and the fact it's holding both the mayor and the combined authority, I think, recognises how power will shift about, as is the need for an independent or an appropriate chair. But I think we mustn't presume that a local government plus approach to this is automatically going to work. This is a very different set of powers and a very different set of working. And I think it'll be important that the time is put in so people understand roles, priorities, how scrutiny and other elements of governance are going to work. And also, I think, a challenge for the people doing the scrutiny. We all know the failings of local government scrutiny around capability and capacity. Now we're asking the same people to kind of stretch themselves even further, and I think that's something we'll have to look out for. However, again, it does feel like a really exciting opportunity to do things differently. And, and we all know on the back of Brexit and now as we're in the general election, the public is not fully trusting of its public institutions and officers. So I do think there'll be an opportunity for scrutiny to show how it works. And, what success looks like for me is that we reach the point where local combined authority scrutiny has the same profile as some of the select committees and being a public place where mayors are held to account. It's got that element of dynamic and creativity and combativeness to it if it needs to be. I think the other element just around the Whitehall bit is whether Whitehall will ever actually be satisfied that local scrutiny and audit can sufficiently scrutinise and hold to account local spend. And we have touted the idea of local public accounts committees in the past, and I'm wondering whether now's the time to brush off those ideas. With more money going locally, I think we need something that's a bit more robust in place. And then the final point is around transparency and involvement and the role of mayors and MPs in that. I think, deal making is a process that's always got an element of smoke-filled room, and, with mostly men in this case, carrying out the deals. And the government's timescales and approach demanded this, but it left a lot of people out of the tent. And that was local councillors, as well as the public, as well as LEPs, as well as lots and lots of other people. And I think the challenge to engage, as Clive said, is still a struggle, and the national election won't help, but turnout I think will be fascinating. But it does feel like the mayors and newly elected or re-elected MPs have got a great opportunity here to try and re-engage with the public. And I think that means re-engaging outside of the usual suspects, not getting sucked into the machine of just keeping local leaders and others, and making sure that any boards and forums are truly representative of the communities, and not to bang on about the gender issue, because there are other points of diversity, but it is quite striking around candidates for mayor and others in terms of who they don't represent. And then I think the final bit is what will work is a shared view, and I think personality is key to this. If we can let go, which I'm not sure is possible, around political ego, political capital, organisational sovereignty, these have a really good chance of succeeding. I think if everyone's agreed on the shared goal, then it can work. But if the public are not part of that, I think we'll all struggle to engage.
Great, thanks very much, Jackie. And I think some really interesting points about how and whether this is going to change the way the public feels about government and politics that I'm sure we'll want to pick up in the discussion. Jim, can I come to you next as a really interesting perspective as a local MP in an area with a mayor coming in?
Well, I mean, first of all, I agree with everything that's been said by Jackie and Clive about the context and some of the frustration of this. I think mayoral candidates that are busy drawing up manifestos without the involvement of councillors and particularly council leaders in that area massively underestimate the most effective weapon in local government's arsenal, the mother of all missiles, which is passive resistance. And there is a real danger in this, that mayors who are perceived to be getting ideas above their station, who are perceived to be encroaching on territory that's been very carefully crafted out through the devolution discussions that have been negotiated with government, that have been very then carefully translated into legal jargon within the constitutions of combined authorities, very firmly get put back into their box. I also think, from a practical point of view, and if you've been involved in organisational change and building teams and trying to get systems and processes in place, these are new institutions. Many of them won't have staff in place. Many of them won't even have an office to occupy on the first day when they take office. And so there will be naturally time taken to build that team and that capacity and that resource. And I think some candidates may find that a shock when they get in office, just how much time that can take to achieve. And then, of course, when that's in place, then they've got to negotiate what type of new settlement will be in place when negotiating with the local authorities who effectively have an established presence and mandate of local leadership within those areas. And the truth is, this can't be done by simply saying, I've got a mandate, I've been elected by X million people, and I'm going to do it, and you can't stop me. If you try and stop me, I'll tell the people you're part of the problem, and maybe that's when we get into local government reorganisation, who knows. The truth is, the mayors, certainly in Greater Manchester, Merseyside and the others that are going out now, only have 3 years to make that change happen. The term limits obviously have been reduced. The term time has been reduced to allow it to coincide then with local elections that are taking place. 3 years for the type of pledges that are being made today is a very, very short space of time indeed. So I think either these will be a huge failure, one because in many areas, the mayoral elections are taking place in fallow years. So the voters won't be trekking to the polls to vote for their local councillors. They will be going solely to elect a mayor that they weren't asked for in a process that they weren't engaged with. When the general election's been called, and a lot of voters will be distracted by the political debate that's taken them to June. And so I think turnout could be critical in establishing the mandate for the new mayors across the country, and that will be instrumental then in how much change can be achieved at a local level. I, like Clive, do not share the government's view that these are essential. I find it odd that Secretaries of State, that Chancellors, the Chancellor, the Prime Minister at the time, were insisting that for a fraction of the power that they hold, the person in receipt of that new power had to go above and beyond the democratic mandate that they themselves had. We don't elect our Secretary of State, we don't elect our Chancellor, we don't directly elect our Prime Minister either, but for a fraction of their power we are insisting on the same for elected mayors at a local level. And my strong view is that local government provides the framework, the foundations, it's understood, it's trusted, it's sufficient to be able to receive additional devolved powers today. The public aren't crying out for new layers of government, and they certainly aren't crying out for more politicians. I also worry slightly that the debate is slightly at odds with where we take England post-Brexit. We seem very comfortable talking about Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland in a new devolved settlement, double devolution, devolution plus, mega devolution or whatever. We're not as confident at all at talking about what type of new settlement can be in place for the whole of England. We can all carve out different structures and settlement for parts of England, but the government have failed comprehensively to come forward with a new devolved settlement that covers the whole of England. And there is a worry that I've got. One, that MPs and mayors are set against each other, instead of actually recognising that we all represent the same people and we should have a shared vision for our place and our communities working together. And I do think there is definitely room for a public accounts committee. I wonder whether that could be at a regional level with greater devolved powers, with the ability to retain tax and duties to spend on physical capital investment, focus programmes, potential then to run development agencies, the potential to run regional banks, to really push power down. But my final point is, if we don't allow our ward councillors at a local level to feel that they themselves have been empowered to get on the ground and do the job that they've been elected to do, then actually devolution hasn't worked at all. It will stop at the combined authorities. And if the devolution project has stalled, and my belief is it's more or less stalled now that some key players have moved on, there is a danger that that unit tries to justify its own existence by taking power up instead of bringing power down to that unit of government. And I think that'll be to the detriment, because my final piece and my warning is, if we don't hear the cries that came from the British public during the EU referendum debate about wanting to take back control and have more power and influence over their lives, they will believe strongly that mainstream politicians are setting them up to fail, and we refuse to give them the power that they were demanding. And so we should use this period as a way to genuinely push power down to people and community. And to me, that's got to go beyond mayors, and it's got to go beyond town halls and council leaders too.
Great, thanks very much, Jim. And certainly we've been calling for quite some time here at the Institute for a bit more clarity about what's happening in the rest of England beyond the areas that are going to get mayors next week, because lots of areas, as you know, submitted devolution deals coming up to 2 years ago now and still don't have clarity on is the government going to make more deals? Are we going to see more mayors in different places? What's happening in more of the two-tier areas? So there are lots of unanswered questions at the moment. Andrew?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. It seems that we hold new institutions to a much higher level of scrutiny than we do existing institutions. Jim is right. You know, turnout is going to be a big issue, but it's how we only apply that to the mayoral elections, and we don't ever question the legitimacy of other institutions. That when we have local authorities, particularly when they go in thirds, the turnouts can be very, very low. Indeed, in a sense, we don't necessarily hold our existing institutions, particularly when it comes to voter engagement, I think, to the same level we seem to be applying to these new mayors. And I think that's an interesting observation that we may want to touch on. I think they are important institutions, new institutions, and we should regard them, I think, as agents for change. In a sense, what we've heard and what we've seen is that the status quo is definitely not working in this country. We are incredibly centralised politically and certainly economically in this country, and it's very, very hard for someone to make the argument that in such a centralised system that we are able to make a success of places like Blackpool and Burnley and Blackburn in the way that we have for London and for Brighton and for Bristol. So in a sense that, agents for change, we should regard our new mayors and we should hold them to this challenge, is that they are advocates and agents for change. Not the only ones, but we should regard them as that. They aren't simply going to fit in. I shouldn't think they should just simply fit into an existing system and then carry on as normal. So I think there are important differences. They will be the leader of their place. They're not the leader of the council, or they're not the leader of a political party of a council. They are the leader of their place. And I think the dynamics that they bring to the table will be different from the existing set of council leaders that form the combined authorities or whatever else. And when you look at the manifestos of those that wish to be the mayors in the 6 places that are voting next week, it's interesting that as much of their time and effort in their manifestos are about issues that they don't have formal hard powers over, as they do. I think that's a great thing. I think that's a great thing where they're going to turn to government and to their local institutions and say, these are the things that need to change. This is the way that the public wants change to happen. Who's going to make it happen? Who's going to work with me to do that? So I think them not being constrained by the relatively limited powers that they've got currently is a good thing. I think that's a lesson from mayors around the world. It's certainly a lesson from the mayor in London, been doing things and was always doing things from the start that they have no formal powers on, and they accrete powers over time. So I think the wielding of the softer power, and I do think the directly elected mandate will matter when they get into negotiations and debates with their council colleagues and their MPs, I think really does matter. By and large, I think when you look at the powers that they've got, they differ. That's the important point. What's on the table for the Metro Mayor of Greater Manchester is quite different from what's on the table for the Metro Mayor of the West of England or Cambridge. Health and police, significant issues in Greater Manchester, not in many other places. Even planning in Cambridge and Peterborough, not a statutory responsibility over strategic planning. That is in the case of it. So there are different powers on the table, but by and large, I think skills, transport, housing, those are the kind of economy things that matter. They all matter and work and need to be organised at the more than local level. None of those things work at the neighbourhood level or at the local authority. They work at much bigger scale. So thinking about how you bring planning decisions to transport decisions to housing decisions, they happen at the GM level, they happen at the West Midlands level. They've got those sorts of powers in various ways. So I think they've got enough to be going on with. They'll be agitating for more, and they should be agitating for more from local authorities as well as from central government. Should be thinking about how some of those powers that relate to the economy can be shifted up, as well as powers from government shifted down. The big missing bit, it's a big question, Clive has done great work on this in the past, is control of the tax base. The Mayor of New York controls 50% of the tax base for that city. The mayors of our places will, if you're generous, control about 5% of the tax base in their areas. That's the missing element. Not saying we should get to it now, but we will need to get to it in future. And my final thought on how they work together, I completely agree with Jim in the sense that common ground needs to be found at the local level and at the national level. In a sense, working with others to build common cause on issues, I think, is really important. What's been interesting in the hustings that we've done in the 6 places, you have some mayors that position themselves as a bridge into government. They're a way that they can bridge that national to local. Others have very deliberately set themselves up as challenges to national government, depending upon their political flavour of the different mayors. But all of them, I think, will need to be pragmatic about how they've developed their agenda over time. But let me go back to where I kind of finished. I think we do see, mayors as disruptors. They are disruptors to the existing system, the status quo of the existing system, I think is increasingly not fit for purpose politically and economically, too centralised, too formulaic, not responsive enough at the local level, not responsive to voter concerns and all the rest of it. So we want to see disruption and change in an ordered way, as best we can, making sense of all of that sort of stuff. But we do want to see disruption, and I think the mayors, if they're as good as we hope they are, will be an important part of that system.
Great, thank you very much. That's extremely helpful. And I'd like to pick up one of those points about soft power and perhaps come to Clive to ask you how you think mayors are really going to change the way that Westminster government works. So do you think we're going to see them working together to kind of use that soft power to almost do collective bargaining with central government? Or if not, what's going to happen?
I think they're going to try. I think it very much depends on, we are a little bit unclear, aren't we, about what this government's policy towards devolution is, whether it's something they've got inherited from Cameron and Osborne, where there was a degree of enthusiasm, particularly in the Treasury, for it, and they've just got it and they're having to make do with what they were given, or whether they really want to move it on, in which case they will want to engage with the mayors. But I also come back to the point, and I think it's interesting, one that Jim made as well, about the relationships the mayors have back home with councillors, council leaders and MPs is going to be very important as well. About, if they start to push the boundaries of what their formal power is into areas, maybe soft power, but it may not seem very soft to council leaders whose toes have been trodden on, then you could get an adverse reaction, which means the mayor goes out speaking without support behind them. And be very careful. Some of us are old enough to remember the metropolitan counties, and the metropolitan counties and metropolitan districts fought each other because they were competing on the same ground in areas like planning. Mm-hmm. Now, the combined authorities have worked because they are a coalition of the willing, of councils coming together to pool arrangements because it works in their mutual interest. If the mayor suddenly comes into that pool and then starts to unravel some of those arrangements and start to extend the powers that they've actually been given into other areas, then I can just see problems occurring there. And so personal relationships and how that's done, how the mayor goes about building a coalition within their own area and a base of support to then take forward that argument to government, I think it's going to be absolutely crucial as well.
Absolutely, and I think there's a really interesting balance around kind of whether areas are going to kind of work against each other to try and get kind of new projects coming to their places, or whether mayors are going to kind of work as a group and ask collectively for more power from government. And Jim, can I ask, how do you see it working on a practical level in an area like yours that's going to have a new mayor? How do you think it should best work to get kind of local MPs together to kind of work effectively with the new mayor?
Well, I think for this to work, we need to go back to its starting point. And the starting point was about the devolution and the better delivery of public services, and the economic growth of the local area, supported by strong leadership of place. That was the principle of it. Yeah. We haven't really seen devolution of public services to any meaningful degree. At best, we've seen co-commissioning arrangements being established. The central government definitely still hold the reins on some of that. On economic growth, we haven't seen genuinely the retention of resources that are generated at a local level, so that local areas can themselves decide what to do. So if I give you the example of the Housing Investment Framework, the fund that's been established in Greater Manchester provides £30 million every year for 10 years, so £300 million total. But government are giving that area £30 million a year, but it's determined that money can only be spent on commercially viable developments to developers that are creditworthy, and to avoid state aid rules, it's got to charge that at a commercial interest rate. So if the development is a commercially viable development and the developer is creditworthy and the interest rate is a commercial rate, then you might as well just go to a bank. So what's the role of the public sector in that mix? Well, actually the demand in Greater Manchester is for the 3,500 hectares of brownfield land that it can't afford to redevelop, and at the same time they're giving £76 million a year to government in stamp duty receipts. So actually the answer there, in my strong view, is that to allow that area to flourish and for it to have a positive focus of how we work together, because we have a common endeavour that we're working towards, they need to be able to structure that themselves. Mm-hmm. Because I think the frustrations, the natural frustrations that will begin to come through will really test even the best of relationships that are developed over a long space of time as people begin to fight for what are a scarce resource. So that, and if you can do it for stamp duty, well, you can do it for other taxes and duties as well. So air passenger duty would be a very obvious one to have devolved to some unit of government. And then the ability to raise new taxes, the freedoms to have more flexibility around council tax banding, revaluations, council tax discounting and exemptions at a local level. We give far more flexibility at the local level to actually free up money to do the things that provide that positive focus for people to work together.
Great, thank you. And Jackie, do you think it is going to improve scrutiny for local people having mayors? Are people going to feel more connected to the politicians in their area? Are they going to feel more engaged with kind of politics?
My instinct is to say no, but I'm going to give a bit more of a considered answer. I mean, I think that the public engages on issues that matter to their lives, and I think if the mayor focuses, and transport is, as every councillor knows, is the top issue. But I think if the mayor is open to having an ongoing dialogue, and that will include scrutiny, that will include how they engage with the public, I think a lot of it then will come down to the issues that they focus on. And at the moment, I think the combined authority deals are a bit too conceptual, a bit too skills. I think once we get down to the point where it is talking about jobs, we are talking about an investment. And I think, for me, the success of the mayor is that people feel a difference in their lives.
Yeah.
And I know that's a bit amorphous and difficult to kind of separate out, but I think getting down to the detail of the element of scrutiny, I think there is a potential of a new governance element to show the mayor being held to account. But unless they do that on issues that matter to the public, they'll again be sitting in empty committee rooms for hours on end, not really making a difference.
And there's been some interesting polling about the kind of issues that the public do care about, which are quite often things like health that in most of these places the mayors are not yet going to have any control over, so that's interesting. Andrew, you've written recently about the kind of impact of the general election on these elections. What are your thoughts on how it might affect things?
Yeah, it was a sort of June the 8th was announced, and it was like, what's up? What does that mean, I think, for the elections? With a pessimistic hat on, and I think that may well negatively affect turnout on May the 4th. I think that people now immediately focus on the national rather than necessarily the local, although engagement with different places over the last few days has given me more room for grounds for optimism that they think there's their continued awareness and activity is holding. So I think there could also be much more straightforward voting on party lines on May the 4th than maybe we would have seen otherwise in places. I think some of the candidates were very strong on local issues, local persona, local connection, irrespective almost of their political party and where they were coming from. I think there's some questions around that. I think so. You can see how I think those sorts of questions or issues might affect May the 4th, because it'll be the first time we go before June the 8th.
Yeah. Okay, that's really helpful. What I'm going to do now is just open up questions to the floor. So we have some roving mics. If you're in the room next door, please do come through if you'd like to ask a question. And please can you keep them brief and say your name and organisation. And I'm going to start with one up here, and please do raise your hand, then the gentleman behind you and the lady behind that.
Mike Walter from Transportation Professional magazine. Transport is often a key topic on the doorstep, with voters complaining about potholes, congestion, the performance of train travel, but the powers given to the new mayors won't necessarily cover all of these issues. So how do we sort of square that circle and explain to the public that actually the mayor isn't responsible for building new roads, or the potholes might be for national government to look after? How do you sort of convince the public that the mayors are needed when perhaps they won't be able to answer all of the questions that they have on the doorstep?
Great, thank you. And if you don't mind passing the microphone directly behind you, thanks.
I'm Nick Sharman, a councillor in Hackney. A couple of questions. One to Jim about the role of local councillors in this. You've referred to it and its importance. My experience in Hackney, where we have an elected mayor, is that local councillors become progressively less relevant because officers concentrate on the mayor. The mayor has the ability to appoint the cabinet, so power absolutely goes to the centre, and local councillors have very little, actually, influence, in my view. The second question is to Jackie, because to me, unless we turn scrutiny, which is a dying function in local councils at the moment, unless we turn that scrutiny function into a serious thing on the lines of a Public Accounts Committee. And remember, the Public Accounts Committee is not just about public, it's got investigation, it's got really strong political direction in it. It's very different to what we have as a scrutiny function. So unless we build that into this new area of really making sure that the accountable isn't to the councillors but to the MPs who have it, we will have a declining role. And what I'm worried about is all this is actually about turning mayors into, if you like, regional outliers, regional supervisors for the government, not about building upwards from below. So unless we have that strong scrutiny, so really, how can we make this public community? And we in Hackney have got the first of the health, combined local government and health. And I can tell you, trying to get the NHS to participate in a scrutiny function is extremely difficult, to put it mildly. So
that's very
how are we going to crack that one?
And the lady just there, thanks.
I've got a mic. My name is Jane Roberts, now from the Open University. The question I wanted to ask was just to push the panel a bit about the issue of public understanding and political engagement, which was the question you asked Jackie, which she touched on. Because arguably that's such a key issue, as we've seen in the referendum and many other places, people's lack of understanding about how politics, inverted commas, works and having little sense of control over their own lives. So in this context, it seems to me that a big flaw was that this new layer has been grafted on to an existing system without any systemic perspective of how it's going to work more broadly. The concerns, one is about the confusion and muddle, simply having no idea about who does what and how, which the panel have touched on. But secondly, echoing Nick's point and something that Jim was saying, is that if you're going to take powers from local councils, not just the leaders, but local councillors who should be, they're not always, but should be that bridge in local communities to local governance, people are going to feel more distant and more confused, and I'm really keen for the panel to pursue that a bit more.
Great, thank you very much. Jackie, can I start with you?
Yes, shall I pick up the scrutiny one first?
Yes, that would be great.
From Nick. I mean, I absolutely agree with you. I think the principle of local government scrutiny works when it's got buy-in from leadership who recognise the value of it and it's invested in. And that's through officer support, training for councillors, etc. The worrying thing from a combined authority point of view is they've asked for one nominated scrutiny officer. So in the West Midlands, that looks like someone 2 days a week. And I think, you know, picking up on the point earlier, these people are going to turn up, but there's no office there. I think the West Midlands is just out now for a chief exec and a few other people. But I think the only way it will work is the mayor gets it, and anyone coming in from a non-local government or public service environment will think it's a crazy thing anyway. They get it, there is investment in it, and that looks like something that's more than a couple of days a week. But also that it has powers that go beyond this very narrow focus, and I think that's where the local public accounts element comes into it, is you can't just scrutinise local government now and then expect to understand how outcomes are achieved. It has to be a whole public service view. We've seen what happens when you take money out of social care and, you know, the impact on the NHS. So we just need this overall view. But I think, you know, scrutiny as a principle works well, even if it's got politics involved in it, but if it's not invested in, and I think that's where hopefully some areas will see the light. I think the potential here is an independent chair. I think with a chair or an appropriate chair, and that being the right person, we've got some chance.
Great, thank you. And Jim, did you want to pick up on some of those, particularly around the role of councillors?
Well, if I come on Nick's point, I can't comment on the situation in Hackney in a knowledgeable way. But what I can say is that I think councillors across the country feel disempowered by the cabinet system and the distance from power that they feel. And I think scrutiny was one way of bringing them in. I think that's been massively affected by the cuts. Policy units were one of the easy targets to go, and the public, I would say, generally would support that. But that has a consequence. What I would like to see in this new world, so we have a completely new settlement, and as part of that new settlement, we have a conversation about where best for power to sit. And one of the systems that I brought in when I was leader of Oldham Council, because I only joined Oldham Council not to change the world, but to change my little bit of the world. Very, very local, trying to make that little difference that would make the place a better place to live in. And actually, I think the public are very realistic and understanding about what they expect from local councillors, but they have no time at all for excuses when it doesn't happen. And a lot of councillors don't ask for anything more than the levers to get the very basic things done quickly and efficiently to deliver that result for the local person. And even as an MP, the amount of casework I get for trees that haven't been cut and back alleyways that haven't been cleaned, and I'm referring that to cabinet members of the council. And I'm thinking, well, I've got better things to do. The cabinet member must have better things to do. And the ward council has been completely bypassed, and the resident just sees that the whole machine doesn't work, and they're frustrated. So I think there needs to be a completely new framing of that, and individualised budgets, far more executive power pushed down to a ward or a district level, the ability for local people to be genuinely engaged at a point in time when they want to be engaged. If I have a number of regrets, I suppose, but one of the regrets I have on leaving Oldham is I could never quite get to a point where I was confident that we involved people at the right point on the right issue. I felt we massively over-consulted on the issues that people just told us to get on and get done, but we thought it was a big thing, so we should over-consult. And actually, the very small things that make a big difference to people, we completely underestimated the impact that had. And it was so far in the process by the time people found out about it, we weren't really able to change course. And the impact that has on relationships is terrible. I haven't got the answer for that, but I think it's an important test. So this isn't just about giving power to councillors, that's important because they have a mandate, but it's also about genuinely giving people the power to affect change. And that's not always coming to a committee room in a cold church hall.
Great, thank you. And Clive, did you want to pick up on some of those around kind of the public understanding and confusion about who does what, or indeed any of the others?
I think it is, and I think we're going to be with that confusion for some time because, and it's right, we've got different arrangements in different of the mayoral combined authority areas. Just on the transport one, it's also difficult if we're generally trying to push powers down rather than move them up. Because you could give the mayor complete powers over transport, but then you were transferring all the highway powers that currently local councillors get involved in up to the mayor. Now that's in the opposite direction. We are actually going to give mayors buses, I think, in all the combined authority areas. In a way, that is a bit transferring power down, because at least they'll be able to adopt franchising and have some say in what happens to local bus services. I mean, effectively now the transport authorities have got no say at all. With the small budgets available, Transport for London has got powers, but certainly you haven't in outside London. There's just commercial operated services with a tiny bit of top up at weekends and evenings. So there, I think there is actually a chance to make a difference with more powers at local level. But council shouldn't be excluded. And I totally agree with Jim's point there, that it isn't just about creating a mayor and combined authorities. What most of the issues that matter to people are in their local communities, on the ground, that council should be dealing with if they have the ability and the powers to do it. So actually pushing with powers within councils down to councillors and giving more power at ward level to get on and do things, and even transferring budgets down there, I think it's something some councils have done, a few, and others have used the excuse of the cuts to actually cut away all the support and facilities for local councillors and simply centralise more and more within their councils. And councils have done it in different ways. So I think there's a challenge there throughout local government to look at not merely devolving to local government, but within local government itself.
Great, thank you. Andrew?
Yeah, so I think, I agree with both Jim and Clive on some of those things. And I think, Clive was saying, which is right, the mayor on transport, his or her formal powers and responsibilities are strategic in nature. They're trying to provide or put in place, a system that actually operates across the whole area that they are responsible for. In the same way as in London, the primary transport responsibility for the Greater London Mayor, Khan, is the TfL, which is a kind of a London-wide transport system. It's not about local roads. I mean, those are responsibility of other agencies, the local authorities, etc. So I think just being very clear about the strategic nature of the mayor and where their responsibilities lie and where their jurisdictions lie is very important. And it's not local in the sense that they will look to acquire local powers, I don't think is an argument. They will look to acquire more strategic powers and rightly so. And I do think that is important. I mean, just say a little bit on the understanding and engagement of the public question. I mean the very simple kind of way of thinking about these things, and it is too simple, so recognise that, is just simply turnout. In 2000 in London, when we went to elect the mayor, the turnout was around 30%. In 2016, it was 45%. Satisfaction levels for the mayor are high and increasing. Now, you can wash them away and say they're not really important, but they are significant factors about engagement, people understanding what the mayor is and being prepared to go out. You look at the Bristol mayor, the first election we had in 2012, it was around 32%. When George got in, George Ferguson. The recent one when Marvin got in, that was up to 45%. And if that's about awareness and understanding, I'm not saying it's a perfect measure, but it's not a bad measure about the willingness of politicians of all stripes, of all positions, to be able to engage with the public, to make the case as to why people should be out voting and engaging. I think that's not a bad measure. And I would want to see, measures of success for each of these mayors, is that the turnout in 2020 is higher than it was than it is or will be in 2017, and it's demonstrably higher than we ordinarily get for local authorities, which is very, very low. Very low. It's quite low for by-elections as well at the national level, but for local authorities, it's very low. Very low.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. And can you also perhaps pick up, Andrew, a bit on the kind of mayor's office? And a few people have mentioned, is it going to be a bit of a shock to these mayors when they come in and find they don't have an enormous staff as they would have, and perhaps in some places in America and so on. So how's it going to work with the kind of combined authority staff versus the mayor's office?
It's worth saying just on that point, they're being hit on both sides on this. They're being hit by combined authority leaders who are already employing the head of paid service before the mayor's in post. Quite a deliberate act in my view. And secondly, by the Secretary of State, who in law is restricting the number of political advisors a mayor can have to one. So they're being targeted on both ends.
Yeah, and again, I think that's the great point. I mean, in no way will their office be incomparable, to anything. Certainly not to mayors overseas, not even to the London mayor, which is considerably resourced compared to what we'll see. And I think there will be some. I think there'll be an interesting question and issue, Jim's right, in the way that the combined authority engages with and is prepared to support the mayor. And to see that as part of a civic duty over and above, just an institutional responsibility, in that the mayor, is responsible, is directly elected, and there is a civic duty on officers to make sure that those politicians are able to do what's required. So I think there'll be an interesting question, but you're right. I mean, there will. On whenever it is, on the Saturday or on the Monday, I think some will be in for quite a shock.
I think if someone comes in from outside from the private sector,
it's going to be really interesting. No, it's very true.
I was at a meeting yesterday where someone mentioned that the Mayor of London got 7,000 letters every year, and having a staff of 2 or 3 in the Mayor's office to deal with that, and plus all the other correspondence in itself is going to be challenging. Can I take another round of questions? Lots of hands up. So I've got one at the front here. And the lady just there, and the gentleman behind, and then I'll come back for a next set. I'll come back to you. Great. Do you want to go first?
Paul Dossett from Grant Thornton. My point really is about, I worked with local government for a long time, and I would say it's at the zenith of its competence and efficiency in the level of my career. So Jim's points about capability of councillors and local authorities to do a lot of these things, and you don't need mayors to do them, I think it's a very valid point in reality, but we don't often live in reality. And I think, over my whole career I've seen, and many others would have seen, there's been a constant narrative from both central government and the media, both national media and local media, that's negative about local government. So is the mayor's some way of actually increasing the powers locally, because we have to find a new way to do things, and it's just a different way of doing things.
Great, thank you. And the lady just two behind you, thank you.
Hi, my name's Sue Maddock. I'm Manchester Business School and UWE, and I've been involved in place shaping for some time. I think one of the problems that we've got, I'd like to carry on, the conversation in relation to scrutiny, because I think we have to actually look at what we're actually scrutinising, because if we don't, we're oscillating between, is it a good thing or isn't it a good thing? It depends totally on the context, who's driving it. So I now live in the southwest, where, to be perfectly honest, the devolution agenda is understood by most people in lots of places are being driven by the LEP, for instance. There's absolutely no agreement. They don't own it at all. It's completely different in Manchester, where the and also in cities. And there's something about us having some criteria around what it is that we're saying, that the direction of travel is a good one, where there's a tension, for instance, for a very, very healthy local social enterprise, but there's fantastic weakness at the strategic governance level, as there is, for instance, in Devon and Cornwall, and where there's some interesting things going on, but there's no traction, there's no voice, and sometimes the voice, into government draws you into mayors, which I've also come round to thinking, in Bristol there are some examples of where they are trying to do some interesting things, of having commissions that are community based, where they're trying to connect the engagement side with the strategic side, but they're probably never going to be as good as pulling levers with the Treasury, for instance. And I think if we can't, the thing that I've discovered, I did some work with Plymouth before there was a sort of Southwest leadership group, and the biggest thing that we needed was a narrative that everybody could there was a conversation about what we were trying to do across sectors. There were arguments, but at least there was a narrative that motivated the change. Does that make sense? So there's something about tools in there. So but if we get too heavy on how dreadful it is, we're going to undermine, in the way in which Andrew's talking, about the good stuff that's happening.
Great, thank you very much. And the gentleman behind you.
Robert Morland. I'm one of the things you haven't mentioned there. I was a councillor for actually where you're sitting, and also latterly for Gloucester, but I should also add I did represent Staffordshire, including Stoke-on-Trent, in the European Parliament for 5 years. Stoke, if I may say so, Britain's most neglected city. But my question is quite simply... Because your party didn't do very well there recently, I would be careful. I go along with Andrew Carter, and my simple question is that I do think a lot of the oomph behind the elected mayors was getting things done, and particularly because councils really didn't have much of a role on the economic. And what I wonder, if you could comment on, is to whether actually the top thing ought to be what you are doing in all your work about the economic side. I mean, we've seen, for example, the change from the regional development bodies to the LEPs, and it seems to me that we're beginning to have a focus more on councils doing much more in relation to economic development. Would you comment?
Great, thank you very much. Clive, can I start with you this time on, there's quite some interesting points about narratives, either around kind of people understanding what we should be scrutinising, or indeed our mayor's a way of changing the narrative for local government, as well as that kind of focus on the economic side.
I think they probably are, because the public won't get most of the complications, but they'll get someone who's there who's new and different and has got some extra things they can do. And I think it'll be at that sort of level, whether they can actually do them, I think, is then going to be the challenge. They won't have many of the powers the public think they have, and therefore is going to be key about how they work with existing organisations, with existing combined authority and council leaders. I think, from my perspective, we've got to try and make them work. I wasn't happy that the government insisted on mayors as a price for devolution deals. I didn't think that was necessary, but that's where we're at. And government may have thought that was because local government wasn't popular, but actually local government's always been, in the public eyes, more popular than central government, if you actually look at the opinion polls over the years on a regular basis. So, we don't therefore have an elected president because our present politicians at national level aren't getting the sort of popularity they may crave. In terms of the economics of it, I think the mayors are going to have an important economic role, and it is interesting that and it's why it began with the cities and why many of these arguments are framed around cities, because the government, I think, rightly saw that if you look at our major cities in this country, with the exception of London and just about Bristol, they all have a GVA less than the national average. It is astounding. And you go to every other continental country and all their major cities perform economically better than the national average. And in the UK it's exactly the worst, the reverse. So clearly there is a need, and that's because all our economic powers and levers are so centralised. All our major companies have their headquarters down in London, different to Germany again. So how you can give more powers out there at a sub-regional level was I think the initial driving force behind devolution, and that's where the idea of the mayors came from. Yeah, the government could have done more. I remember when we started looking at devolution on the Select Committee back in 2010. We had the leader of Barnsley and the leader of Surrey sat before us, both saying, for heaven's sake, allow us to run the work programme. Because we can run this better and more cost effectively than central government. Well, I think that's been proved by the fact the work programme has been a pretty awful failure for the amount of money being put into it. And why did they say that? Because they both recognise Surrey and Barnsley are different places with different needs and different solutions. And so I think the government could have done an awful lot more within the existing local government structure and can still do so. Because lots of that work can still be done at local council level, not just at the combined authority level. And yes, all right, in the wider context, LEPs, one of the things we should be doing as part of this change is to make LEPs accountable. They spend an awful lot of money, and if we're talking about scrutiny, how much public scrutiny really goes into what the LEPs are doing on behalf of the public with public money?
Great, thank you. Andrew, can I come to you next?
Yeah, so I mean, just to pick up on the economy then, Clive said that those are the origins for the reasons that he's outlined. I mean, it's important to remember 50% thereabouts of working age population live in one local authority, work in another. Now think about how you coordinate. Now, and it's, we can debate whether the mayor and all the rest of it, but the point is, when we think about how an economy functions, how the everyday life of people functions, it's rarely within one local authority. It's mostly, typically, at the city region level. You see that in Greater Manchester when you look at the transport patterns. You see that in the West of England when you look at the transport patterns. You see that when you look at the West Midlands and the transport patterns. People are living and working and playing across the piece. And there are transport and housing and land use challenges that we need to grapple with. And you cannot do that at the local level. You have to do that at the level of that geographical scale. And that is typically in this country, city regions, is in fact across other places. Regions too big. Local too small, city regions, which is the geography of everyday life. So this important point. Then you have to ask the question, we're asking politicians of various stripes, varying denominations, to make quite significant and serious decisions about transport and housing and land use planning. That is not just for today, but it's actually 30 years, 50 years, 150 years in the making. Influences places over longer term. I think there should be we think there should be a very strong electoral mandate to that, and mayors give you a vehicle alongside and working very closely with the combined authorities of doing that.
That's great, thank you. Jim?
I think quite a lot of this comes down to not necessarily identity of local authorities versus the identity of the mayors. It comes down to a sense of place identity. So the identity that we all as neighbours have for the place where we live. And I think local leadership works well when it has that kind of deep-rooted sense of place and community at its heart. I felt as leader of Oldham Council that I had a strong mandate from the people because we created a vision for the place collectively to do better. And I think Greater Manchester definitely can have that. It can have a Greater Manchester identity because its history allows it to. Actually, I would say that the boroughs that make up Greater Manchester are themselves artificial constructs. There's many people who live in the neighbouring boroughs in Greater Manchester who consider themselves to be Mancunians. There'll be others who think they live in Yorkshire still. The lines that we draw on maps are not always the same kind of identity that people hold as an identity about themselves. And I think that's really important when we talk about whether or not mayors will work or not. Because the truth is, to get the economies of scale that you need, you have to cover a geographical and a population level that just doesn't work for the identities that some places have. And the counties are a really good example of that, where we've got some extremely artificial constructs that have been brought together to try and justify devolution deals that are so far removed from people's own self-identity that I think it's going to make that kind of civic duty that we talked about before extremely difficult, because actually if you haven't got popular support for what you're trying to do built around that vision for a place, I think it's going to be very difficult to make progress, is the truth.
Great, thank you. Jackie?
I think just continuing on the economic point, for the mayors to work in relation to the economy, they're probably not going to spend a great deal of time in this country, never mind their local patch. You know, this is an international world that we live in, and the sort of investment that we need doesn't come from sitting in an office somewhere. And I think that sense of where these people will play, and you've seen it with some of the candidates now, you know, there's a lot of time that they need to be putting in to collect those investors. I think the challenge will be, in order to make things work back locally, you need to do all the heavy lifting, and 3 years is not a great deal of time to do that. I think on the point of local government being at the zenith of its competencies, I don't think it's done a great deal to help itself in terms of selling the fact that it's doing a great job. I know it's a kind of handy place to do some kicking, but I don't think it's helped itself. I do think the election being called gives us a chance to look at what Devo 2 looks like for those areas who didn't want a mayor. And, you know, on Andrew's point, we can't carry on going as we're going, 400 odd councils, etc. It's just, you know, you would never draw it that way. However, I do think there needs to be an argument, which is how does this system work in the future based on strong councillors and leading up, because, you know, we haven't got George Osborne and others promoting the idea of mayor, so what does an alternative look like? And I think local government needs to come up with itself. I think on the final point around what to scrutinise and the narrative, absolutely, and you know, hopefully what you get with that strong regional presence is someone who can sell a narrative, who's someone who's got the political skills to put forward a vision for a place, and then that you can then scrutinise that. And I think the two elements for scrutiny will be holding them to account and really, you know, making sure that that does happen. But the second is making sure they're focusing on the issues that matter most to the public. So if, you know, the mayor gets distracted, scrutiny needs to be the place where they're asking, what are you doing about the issues that are most important? Why aren't the jobs coming here, etc. Yeah, and I think that's the job. If they're going to be disruptors, they need to be clear what's not working in the system.
Great, thank you. And then we're going to take a further round of questions. One here, the gentleman at the front, then there's a gentleman right at the back, and a third one just here. Thanks.
Brian Hanks, thankfully retired. I thought it was a fascinating debate, and I'm glad to see two people from the north who've got some hands-on experience, and too many people from the Westminster Village. So we get a rather lopsided approach to these things. But stepping back from the detail, local government has been stripped of its powers and slowly destroyed by successive governments. And what you get today are cuts by Osborne, which is carried out over a period of 6 years, stripping local government and the people and the communities of social and cultural achievements. Huge cuts in the numbers of people, and planning departments particularly have suffered. But the biggest problem of all is someone referred to the Mayor of New York of having 50% of raising his funds. On the continent, it's generally speaking 80 to 85%. And in this country, as it's been pointed out, it's something like 5 to 10% wherever you go, even in London. So the mayors of London have very few powers. So you've got that destruction of local government, denuding it of skills, because they haven't been replaced by better people. There are fewer people and they're not the same quality. And lack of finance. And in the middle of this, you plump. This guy is going to be a mayor. And how was it done? It was done by Osborne bribing them. It was blackmail, in fact. I'll give you some money if you elect a mayor. That is not the right way to approach fundamental changes to local government. And this concept of the mayor, I think, will fail unless there's some fundamental changes, which have been hinted at by both Clive Betts and Jim McMahon.
Great, thank you. And then right at the back, sorry, on the back wall. Thank you.
Thanks. Abdul Kara from the National Audit Office. Not all everything I'm going to say is the official position of the National Audit. So one of our official positions is to support kind of Jackie's point on scrutiny. We're particularly concerned about the kind of accountability mechanisms for spend. There is no mention or very little mention of value for money, and that's something we'll be paying close attention to over the next year. Slightly less officially, 2 points. One is around kind of economic growth versus service delivery. We certainly see the mayoral combined authorities as focusing largely on economic growth, to the extent that there is kind of collective service delivery. It will be driven by the local authorities rather than the mayor, because they believe their economies of scale, or because there's a dearth of directors of children's services or something like that, not because it's the mayor's ambition. So given the focus on economic growth, and frankly the lack of evidence about what drives economic growth, transport being one of those things, but housing possibly, who knows. I'm surprised not to have heard anyone speak about the industrial strategy. So the mayors, as somebody's just said, were kind of Chancellor Osborne's view about how you drive economic growth. The government of today has a slightly different view, and who knows what the bums on the seats following the 8th of June will say. But certainly the game in town today is the industrial strategy. And when you read the Green Paper, it does not scream, mayors are a way of driving productivity.
Great.
So what's the future going to look like if the industrial strategy is the thing that has traction following the 8th of June?
Great, thank you. And then there was one just here. Thanks.
Excuse me, Bob Chilton, late of just about everything, including the GLA, the Audit Commission, the Standards Board and the Local Government Commission, indeed very late of Sheffield Council many years ago. What comes across is that the events on May the 6th are work in progress. Nobody is arguing this is a resolved solution that is consented and going. It's a dynamic that's being unleashed. And what's interesting about the situation is that there are enough examples with 6 plus existing mayors to have a laboratory for examining where this is all going to go. Yeah. What I'm not entirely clear about, although there have been hints at it, and indeed the last questioner was raising some aspects of this, is what are the criteria? What are the evaluative criteria that are going to lead to an assessment? And they may not all be all agreed, but there should be a debate around where they are. We've seen some contradictions. Clive's argued for a consenting situation with the rest of local government. Andrew argued for a disruptive mayor at one stage in his presentation. I mean, interesting solution. So, question, what are going to be the criteria? And then what are going to be the architecture of the arrangements for applying those criteria? If the Audit Commission still existed, we'd be setting up an evaluative framework. There's a hint from the last question that the NAO may get there around here. But maybe local government, maybe Clive's own committee needs to be thinking now about the architecture of the process, etc., for learning from this to move on to what's going to be the next stage.
Absolutely, and we've talked a lot here about the kind of policy laboratory that's being set up across the country and actually learning from what works, and indeed sharing that learning across different areas is going to be really critical. Andrew, can I come to you first?
Yeah, so very briefly. Completely agree with Brian. In a sense, we've seen a persistent across political parties for the best part of 100 years, but certainly 80 years, of removal of powers and responsibilities away from local government. I'd argue, maybe in a moment of naivety, that this offers us a chance to reverse that. This is the start, goes to your point, a dynamic process, a start to reverse that process. I think we've got as far, we tried centralisation, we tried it as far as we possibly could. We definitely went to the zenith of centralisation in this country. It ain't worked. You got enough places across the country, it ain't, whatever it's meant to be doing, it ain't doing it. So in a sense, a shift away from centralisation as a means to do whatever it's meant to do. I think see this as the start of that process. See this as a start of rebalancing where power and responsibility and civicness lies. Not only to think about Westminster and Whitehall, but to think about places that are can do this if they're given flexibility and freedom to do that. Gentlemen, on economic growth, I think we do have a sense as to the observables when we think about what drives economic growth. It's just that they tend to be some of the things that people don't particularly like focusing on, and actually they're many of the things that industrial strategy and others don't typically focus on, which is the skill levels of our residents and our workforce, greatest determinant both into the now and into the future as to whether places are successful, whether transport systems, public and private, are reasonably sensible and can allow people to move backwards and forwards across places. So I think we do have a sense of that. We've had industrial strategies in the past. Not to say they're not important, but we shouldn't expect this to be the reversal of, this is one component of all of that. And then just this reflection on criteria. I think it's an interesting question. What's the criteria for judging whether central government is effective and efficient? What's the criteria generally? What's the checklist? I'd love to see it. What's the checklist for determining whether local government is effective? This is my point that I started off. There seems to be a bar here on mayors and on this sort of, that is much higher than we place on Jim as an MP or indeed as a former leader of a council, other than my sense is if Jim does a bad job, he gets voted out. Is that the criteria? I don't know. But let's just be careful when we go down this route of scrutiny and criteria and uniformity, that we don't apply artificial and very elevated thoughts on what will determine success when we don't apply that anywhere else, particularly in the public policy world.
Great, thanks. Jim?
I think, as I was just saying, Bob, as you were reading off the list of organisations you work for, I was getting to the end and wondering if Sheffield City Council was being abolished. But it still exists, I think. I'm not sure you can take the existing mayors as a temperature check or success or not about how the combined authority mayors will work. They are very different in their nature. A directly elected mayor of a council is a council leader plus. And I should say that's coming from a point of view where I hold council leaders in extremely high regard. So that's not a detriment to that. I think it's just a very different role. Certainly haven't got the direct levers of power that you have as a council leader or a mayor covering a local authority area. You have thousands of staff, even in very desperate times. You have many millions of pounds to spend, and there are choices within that mix where you can deploy resources when you need to. I think the point, Brian, you make about the local government being stripped back is a fair one. It's self-evident. There are far less staff, people on the ground. There are less services being delivered. There are less facilities. But the truth is, whoever's in government, we will never go back to what was there before. The civic infrastructure that has been dismantled was built up over centuries, over generations, and there won't be any incumbent government that can find the resource to rebuild that now. And I suppose there is a question in that about, well, is that right for the future anyway? Because it strikes me that the public expectation of how they receive services, how they access services, is very different in the future than it was in the past as well. And how we design those services around people and community will be different in the future. But there should be an adequate resource to deliver public services to a reasonable standard in every area of the country on a fairly assessed need-based formula. and that's completely absent from the devolution deals that have been agreed. It's completely absent from the local government finance bill that's due to come back to Parliament. That actually takes away any parliamentary scrutiny of the Secretary of State on that mix. And I think what I'd say is the bit that's missing in the relationship on cash, one is probably a lack of ambition, and by that I mean local government starting to demand now, instead of doing deals very quietly behind closed doors and being fearful of holding government too much to account on saying what they didn't get during that devolution discussion, but also I think for central government too. One quick example, so Greater Manchester, as part of the business rate retention pilot, has got a 4-year retention deal agreed, but as part of that agreement they have agreed to the deletion of the public health grant with almost no consultation or communication with the local government family, as in actually what knock-on effect might this have. Well, it's okay for Greater Manchester for the 4 years that devolution deal's in place, but after the devolution's deal in place, that will be used as a new model potentially for the whole of the country. And at that point, I guarantee, I'll put a pound on it if anyone will take a pound, that Greater Manchester will be in a net worse position at the end of all that. And I think as a sector, local government does need to think about how does it create its own vision for what devolution should be across political party, and say, and this is the bar that we aspire to. And anything less than that is a disservice to what we can achieve at a local level. I've taken enough time. I'm not going to particularly focus on the points you made, other than to say the NAO has a really important role to play in this. You are respected, you have done the groundwork, and I think you've been able to hold government to account on a number of fronts. I suppose what I would say is, I think we need to allow time, and by that it could be a 10-year period, by the way, proper time, for these positions to be embedded and established before we start scrutinising them to a degree. I mean, the point around success being actually outward and being international, well, we all know the FOIs that are going to follow that journey, and that could be the measure of success if we're not careful. So,
yeah, interesting point. Absolutely, thank you. Clive, can I come to you next?
Yes, yeah, absolutely right on the cuts. I mean, central government has picked local government out for the biggest cuts in all the public sector because somebody else has to do it. We're very crude about it. And, and Amias Moses' comments the other day, back to the NAO, we said, local government was really good for a time at doing more for less. But it's got to the point now where it's doing less for less, and people can see it, because it's done incredibly well at managing the level of cuts for as long as it had, but we've now got beyond that point. So it is the issue of tax now, and where we go to in the future. And there are two requirements that any new system of local taxation has got to have. One is the ability to actually raise the money at local level, and we've talked about mayor's capacity in other countries compared with the UK. That has to be a driver. Maybe having these different mayors working together at national level, arguing the case for proper local taxation. But at the same time, and Jim's point's absolutely right, how do we get a fairness in the system to recognise those areas that don't have the ability to raise as much tax? And we've just had the issue with the social care precept, with massive amounts of difference in the money that can be raised at local level to support social care. So you need to do the two things, equalise and also incentivise by accountability of raising money at local level. 100% business rate retention is not the revolution the local government minister says. It's a small, to use those terms, those words, it's a small evolutionary step, and it can't do both things. It can't incentivise growth and be fair and equalise at the same time. It can't do both things, and the government's getting a real mess on that. Just two other points. Industrial strategy. I mean, Greg Clark says it ought to be place-based. I accept there's not much evidence it is at present, but there are some good examples, and I'll come back to my own city of Sheffield, where the advanced manufacturing research stuff is really interesting, with McLaren and Boeing coming in there, and spin-offs now in terms of a distribution network and supply chains beginning to be built up. And that is something that government can support, and it will be done at a local place. With engineering companies in the wider area benefiting from that and from the research facilities available. Finally, Bob, nice to see you again after time. We go back quite a long way to housing developments in Sheffield. You're right. I mean, we've got to think about now where we're going to with devolution. We said as a select committee, we think Now, the deal-based approach is where we started from, and different deals around the country. Eventually, we've got to get to some sort of framework, shaping how devolution works throughout the country. Our instinct was that devolved power should be on offer as a right to local areas. They may not all want to take all the offers up, but they should be available, and that should be the approach. The decision should be made at local level, and government should be saying, indeed, we should turn the argument the way around. Why do we have to argue why things should come down? We should be saying what needs to be done at the centre. Otherwise, the default position should be local. I mean, it's a bit radical, that, but it starts to change the way people think about issues in that way. And it's interesting, we've just done a little legacy report on the committee about what we've done in the last 2 years. And the longest list of things outstanding that need to be picked up on and come back to, including monitoring what progress has been made and how effective it's being, is on our devolution report. And there's an awful lot of things we need to do to pick up on and see how it's working, what needs to be done to put into building that framework up for the future.
Great, thank you. And Jackie?
Yeah, just briefly. I think absolutely agree with the point that local government needs to define its own narrative. I think it's missing from the table now. I think it's, I thought it did a good job around adult social care funding, but Brexit, I think there's whole areas where it absolutely needs to be clear what it wants and how it's going to fit in and what devolution looks like in the future. I think the failing of the deals was the criteria wasn't shared, so everyone reinvented the wheel each time, which is what localism looks like, but I think that we'd absolutely need the framework. I think the sense around the industrial strategy is particularly I think since the post-Brexit, is a lack of coordination across government. What's all the different parts that will make this work, as opposed to it just sitting there in isolation, and hopefully that's something that will happen if local government is able to contribute to that. And I think the final point on scrutiny is not to get too caught up with the following the pound. It's about trust. And I think one of the issues around openness and transparency, which is applied to a lot of corporate organisations and charities as well as public services, is the public wants to know it can trust. And there's different ways, there's a myriad of ways that happens, but I think sometimes when we talk about scrutiny, that's actually what we're talking about, and not just this over-indulgence around what's happening.
Great, thank you. And thank you very much indeed to all of our fantastic panellists and to you for coming today and making sure that people do not forget that we have an important set of elections going on next week, as well as the local elections. So we are going to be continuing to work on this area at the Institute, so please do keep an eye on our website. But please, thanks again very much indeed to Grant Thornton for partnering with us on this event. And please, can you join me in thanking our panellists? Thanks very much indeed. Thank you.